I grew up in Liverpool, which is a city in the northwest of England, and famously it's a poor city, a port city that's also very poor. And in the 1980s, it was very much disregarded by the national politicians in the UK, so much so that Margaret Thatcher, who was in power at the time, determined that the city should go into a state of managed decline. And this was the technical term. So they pulled all the funding out of the city of Liverpool, and it quivered and then fell to its knees. And it was a terrible time to grow up in a place that had literally had no hope, that there was rubbish everywhere on the streets, that nobody had any sense that they could be something other than what the politicians had decided for us. And to grow up then was almost to grow up in a time where I think I felt that I couldn't live this way, and that change had to be possible. And maybe it was then that this kernel was planted in me. But I grew up in a working class family where there was little money and lots of reclaiming of things that other people had already had. You know, the making of a bike new again by sticking a sticker on it, that it was now yours, and other things. And then also I grew up in a family of makers. So my dad would make everything from furniture to repairing teacups and things. And my mum slowly made lots of other things too. And maybe what they made most of all was a family that saw themselves as part of a deep sense of community and change. I grew up in a place that wasn't surrounded by trees at all. In fact, not a single tree was visible from where we lived. And the role that nature plays is a very deep kernel within me. And I'm sort of thinking that maybe there's something deeper that I'm tapping into when I think about my relationship with nature. So anyway, it started back then. And then I was in 1992 already engaged in this work. It was the time of the Rio Earth Summit, and I was doing my undergraduate degree at the time, and I then became very active in this work. And then in the 90s I did a PhD, which I finished in 99, in the last millennium now, so long ago. And then since then I've done loads of radical projects, collaborative work. I've written 10 books, written hundreds and hundreds of papers, but actually had a great opportunity to be part of a group of different sorts of works and change ideas and other things, which is I think beginning to change people's ideas, not only within the sort of field of fashion and sustainability, much broader, about what it means to work in this space. That you don't only have to work within an industry context, that you can actively work for change by doing different things in different ways, and bringing a much more sort of careful, much more ethically, politically engaged and practical sense of what change means to people's lives.
Because it does start with individuals, doesn't it? And yet we need to take that big picture holistic approach as well. And I think, can you tell us a little bit about your own approach to clothing, how that would have played a role in your upbringing and how you ended up being in this space?
So when I was young, in school still, I used to make my own school uniform, and I was bullied like many children who perhaps are a little different. I mean, I don't know quite how I was different. Perhaps I had less of an accent. I mean, Liverpool is famously a very strong accent, and maybe I don't know, I was quite clever, maybe, I don't know, for whatever reason. But over time, my sense of identity was really shaped and fashioned by myself through what I chose to wear, and I would repeatedly make and alter my school uniform. So school uniforms are mandatory in the UK, like I know they are in Australia, but so I was constantly changing it, long skirt, short skirt, like weekend to weekend, altering it, making something new. And it was in that sort of cauldron of forming identity that I realised that this was something that I had power in and with was clothing. And then I went on from there to bring together this sense that I wanted to do something to affect change, and also to do that with clothing in the subsequent work that I did. But it was definitely when I was in school, slugging it out, not physically, but sort of emotionally, finding where I fitted, all of those ways. That's when it made sense. Yeah.
I was really excited to find your work when I began my own journey in that space. So what about natural fibres? What role did they play for you?
So natural fibres are a really important part of this story. I perhaps should declare my interest in that. When I was doing my PhD in the 90s, I was part of a project for a group called Bioregional, and we grew 1.5 acres of hemp to make into UK textiles. And this idea was that we were making clothes for the bioregion of the southeast of England. We were growing the fibre there, and we were trying to process it as close as possible to that region. So back then...
And what time was that? What era was that?
I was in 96, but it was a project that a lot was learned, including how much knowledge we've lost, because hemp was grown by order of the King Henry VIII, for instance, by every farmer in the UK in the 16th century. And it was because it was for use as sailcloth and ropes for the Navy. So it was definitely part of common knowledge. It was, like breathing or something, that sort of knowledge. And now we've just not got the knowledge, not got the machinery, not got the seed types, not got the sensibility around it, lost so much appreciation of what it can be. Anyway, so I digress. So natural fibres are a really important part of this story. They represent perhaps a way to help us look into the context in which we live. Maybe you would say the natural fibre crop of a region, and help us perhaps to dress appropriately accordingly. Cotton could never be grown in the UK context, absolutely never. Our climate is both too cold and too temperate, I think. But certainly here we can grow wool, and do grow wool. There's sheep grazing on all the fields near where I live, and there's a possibility and active growth of both linen and some hemp in the UK still today. But this doesn't really tell the whole story. I wouldn't want you to think that fibres can drive deep change within the clothing and fashion space, because I don't fundamentally believe that they can. I think that deep change has to come from us setting the purpose of the system to a different goal, and then the right choice of fibres will then flow. One of the things that we've learned from studying complex systems, and here when I say we, I mean I'm now deferring to the many wonderful people who've led systems thinking work, like Donella Meadows. What she tells us is that the place we most often begin with explorations for trying to think about change, those places we begin tend to be least generative of deep shifts. And so we all, me too, tend to start with fibres, but what we know about fibres is that the most effort we put in there is least likely to deliver big change. Instead, what we need to do is to sort of affect almost like a counterintuitive shift, and think instead about what is the purpose of this system that we're engaging with. And when we then determine the purpose, for example, around ecological health, then different sorts of decisions will follow. And I'm sure there's a role for natural fibres in that changed system. But starting with fibres alone and not seeing them as part of this big interconnected, interdependent system is never going to deliver the change that we want.
So how do you feel the change can happen then?
Maybe the best sense of change happening comes from like a project of mine that I do with my collaborator Mathilda, Tham, called Earth Logic. So what Earth Logic is, it was commissioned initially as a framework for thinking about action and change, and it resulted in us putting forward a strategy for effectively a paradigm shift. So Earth Logic is a radical invitation to business leaders, to designers, to the media, to policymakers, to citizens, to put Earth first and transform the fashion sector. And the way that we think about it is it's a bit like a kaleidoscope. When you look through a kaleidoscope and you give it a shift, a turn, that you see new patterns and configurations, and you see different pathways, different possibilities of what clothing can be. And we need to effect a shift of this kaleidoscope. And this is important because it's almost like a new way of seeing. It replaces the dominant thinking at the moment, which is where everything is shaped around the growth logic, the economic growth logic, and it replaces it with a new logic which puts Earth and health of the Earth at the centre of all practices.
That's just awesome, Kate, really. How achievable is it when we have the whole economic drivers, and even coming out of the pandemic, is this sort of geeing up about, oh yes, we need to get our economy back on track. You know, these are big obstacles, aren't they?
They're huge obstacles, and I think that's one of the things, is that no one is saying it's going to be easy. But ultimately, I mean, and this is a well-worn expression, but there is no business to be done on a dead planet. And what we're seeing at the moment, I mean, in Australia in particular, you would say you're the canary in the coal mine of climate change impacts. And you're beginning to live those on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, the extremes of weather, the other implications for what's going to happen on the Australian continent. I mean, it's the same in Europe too. And I think people are beginning to realise that superficial change is no longer a strategy. Also, maybe what we're saying is that we've discovered, I mean, we've been doing Earth Logic work now for 3 years, and last week I was in Stockholm at the United Nations Stockholm Plus 50 event. So this was an event that was marking 50 years on from the first United Nations conference on the environment in Stockholm in 72. And so we did 3 Earth Logic events there, and what we see is that individuals come to Earth Logic workshops and they just feel a tremendous sense of relief that actually we don't need to pretend any longer. We can say, okay, economic growth logic is the single biggest inhibiting factor to affecting deep change. We made the growth logic system. We can unmake it and make something else that's more compatible with life on Earth. And when people see that and feel that, there's such a sense of relief. So what we see is that individuals love Earth Logic and organisations find it tricky, and that's because of the cultures and other things, the systems that are set in place. And yet all organisations are made up of individuals. And so there is a sense that things are beginning to shift, and we notice such a change in people's attitude. You know, degrowth conversations, post-growth conversations were taboo a couple of years ago in the fashion sector. People got angry when we talked about what does it mean to perhaps think about less in this space. And people are now talking about them with curiosity. So they're no longer taboo, they're part of the dialogue. I'm not saying that necessarily people are acting on them. Some people are determining that their businesses won't grow beyond a certain scale. Some people are seeing their businesses in different ways, but there is a substantial shift.
It must be exciting for you to be observing that.
Yeah, it's hugely gratifying, and there's always a sense of there's more to do, but it doesn't mean that you don't appreciate when the good stuff comes. It is gratifying, deeply gratifying. Many other things, yeah, it is.
There's a lot of talk about the circular economy as being the salvation, and recycling, reusing textiles. How does that fit into Earth Logic?
So the circular economy has got a lot of attention, a lot of column inches dedicated to it. And I think that within Earth Logic, circular principles and ideas fit, but only in as much as they're linked to resourceful practices. But the notion of the circular economy as a standalone concept is, I think, quite problematic. And I would say that this is for like a host of reasons, tied to things as varied as the laws of thermodynamics, tied to the idea that in the circular economy, what's circling are the values of the old system, round and round and round. And also in the circular economy, it's linked at the moment to technology for recycling garment to garments that is as yet undeveloped. So it's in a sort of wish for the future. So to take those one by one, maybe you would say that the laws of thermodynamics tell us that systems always move to a state of disorder. And the same, of course, applies to the fashion and textile system. And what we see is that the circular economy presupposes that you can control and close a loop. But the fashion, clothing and textile space is not a closed loop, and it never will be. It involves selling goods, clothing goods, textile goods to people who then take them home, wear them maybe a couple of times, stick them under the bed, throw them out the window. They end up in, I don't know, somebody's summer house somewhere, if you've got such a thing. And it is fundamentally a leaky open system that you can't fully control. And as a result, it's not ever going to be closed and fully circular in the way that it's proposed. Michael Braungart recently said that, circular design is really important in all sectors, but doesn't really work in textiles and should never have been applied. And it's simply because this lack of control over the actual resources. It's not like it's a photocopier that sits in an office and it's like an integrated unit, a single unit. It's multiple small dispersed items, pairs of tights, knickers, tops, jackets, and they just get dispersed around the place. And then maybe one of the second point where I was saying about the circular economy circling old system values and ideas is the circular economy is welcomed by many business sectors because it really can be added on to existing business priorities, which are largely linked to furthering economic growth. And why that's it's not problematic per se to limit for that, but what it's preventing at the moment is any other deep sort of change, because they're just adding circular priorities onto existing business practices and not actually changing fundamentally anything within the business practices. It's almost being used as a fig leaf to distract attention from changing other things, because the assumption is that a circular business idea will fix the rest of the broken system, and it simply won't.
So it sounds like greenwashing almost.
I think the circular principles, it's like a rebranding of the things that many people have always done, which is handing clothes down to cousins or sisters and brothers, to neighbours, to circulating things in the local community. It's those things that we've done where we reuse one thing, cut up an old t-shirt and reuse it as a duster. It's all of those things, the recycling of things to make it into rag rugs, whatever it is. It's a term that's now been co-opted to suggest that the things that we've already done are somehow new and to bring them into the economy. And as we know, there are many limits to markets. People have shown that there are moral limits to markets where you can't, pulling things into the market sometimes corrupts them. And we've discovered, there was a really interesting book by a guy called Michael Sandel, who talked about how when you do take things into the marketplace, how you can really change levels of engagement. And he, for example, gave examples like giving blood. The moment that you paid people to give blood, people didn't see it as part of their community or moral responsibility to society, and so they just went, oh, well, we don't need the money. And blood donation levels dropped through the floor. So there are these very clear moral limits to where markets should and shouldn't go, and these things were already existing. And what is unclear is whether bringing them into the market and allowing industry to marketise them and then have responsibility for them is actually doing anything to increase the resourcefulness of the sector. I don't think there's any data about that at all.
It's so fascinating, really, because ultimately it then comes back to consumer choices and behaviour, our behaviour, the culture of how we use clothing. So in your Earth Logic model, how does that work?
So certainly one of the things that's really important is that we recognise that responsibility for what goes on in this space is shared. It's not only with, I mean, some people think, oh, it's just with industry, and certainly they play a role, but actually it is true that we all play a role. But one of the things I think is also really important is that if we activate care, and care is a really big theme that goes through Earth Logic, and it's a very topical theme within many academic circles at the moment. But care isn't just the practical sort of paying attention to and looking out for and things. It's also the recognition that you stand in solidarity with others, that it's like a political and ethical practice of engaging in the world. The good thing about thinking about care is that many of us already practice care. We look after our children, we care for them, we care about the way we do the dishes, or maybe not. But so these are, it's like activating a process that's already very familiar to us. And what it does critically is it takes the power for who is responsible for this away from the centre, maybe away from policymakers, and into all our lives. So care decentralises the business of taking action and makes us all able to do something today. Because sometimes people, they feel a little bit like they don't know where to begin, what to do, how to act. And by thinking about this as just another one of the many practices of care, I think it's a way to do that. It's not trying to burden people unnecessarily and take responsibility away from the big brands, because they do have a huge impact. But it's about trying to make sure that we all feel engaged.
And that care, I guess, was expressed in your book, Craft of Use, really, wasn't it? So can you give some more ideas about how we can care better for our clothes and our place, and how we can help change and influence the bigger system?
Well, there are so many things. Maybe I have a sense that that the art, and maybe it's a political practice too, of noticing is a really important way to begin. I mean, one of the things we understand, for example, about mending is that you have to find the problem in the first place. You have to analyse the problem. It's as much about problem finding and understanding as it is about solving with the actual act of a needle and thread and a pair of scissors. You need, before that, to be able to understand the problem. And to understand the problem, you have to activate this other sense of being alert in the world with what you're wearing, and also to all of the other things that are going on. So maybe the art and practice of noticing is the beginning point for all the other things that unfold. And then there's all of the stuff that I think we do and know about that is to do with reckoning with what we have as valuable material resources that also help us to engage in the world, and seeing clothes in an active state. Maybe people talk quite a lot about thinking about clothes not just as nouns but as also verbs, as things that enable us to be something. And I think that is a really powerful way. So it's not just about what they are, it's about what we can do and become that feels really important. I'm sure many other people that you'll speak to will rehearse all of the practical things that we can do with clothing. I could do this for you too, but maybe what is different about what I've been tangling with recently is by thinking about clothing and its relationship that it has with nature as a way to help us to engage with a different sort of understanding about the ecological context in which we live. And this is one of the really joyful and deeper insights that I think in recent years I've understood. It's a bit like if you walk in hills in a skirt, very quickly, if a skirt is tight, you'll understand something about the topography. If the skirt is loose, you will see different sorts of relationships, maybe with the weather, with a sense of what's around you. You will begin to navigate the world differently because of what you're wearing, and you'll begin to notice different things about it. So with this understanding of the relationship between clothes, the body, the sensory engagement with the world, then we invite in a different set of relationships with it. Fundamentally, environmental philosophers would say that at the root of the crisis of unsustainability are three different things. One of them is about a lack of connection with the world in which we live, with nature. The second one is a lack of connection with each other as human beings. That's fallen away as we've all retreated into bubbles of individualism, perhaps facilitated by capitalism. And the third is a lack of connection to your sort of true sense as a human being. And for me, clothes are a unique artifact in the way that they are like a key that unlocks the door to experiencing the world in a different way. I actually sort of can't think, maybe shoes is another one, but there's not like there's another product that has this potential to help us engage with or connect with what the world is. They invite us outside, they invite us into the world in which we live.
That seems as if it's going to be integrally connected with our health and well-being then, our clothes and our approach to that. Would you like to speak to that point at all?
Yeah, it's massively linked. What we see is that many of the skills that we engage with when we use and remake our clothes over time, those same skills and ideas and practices and capabilities give us a sense of satisfaction, which is very similar to that which we're seeking when we go out and buy a new piece of clothing. So very quickly we can see that the thing that we're sort of pining for when we go out shopping for new pieces can be provided for in a very similar set of experiences with all of these other practices. It can supplant some of the things that seem very attractive to people, and more than that, it can begin to foster a sense of self-confidence, that shifting unease that we get from changing fashion cycles. It can help establish us as people who are perhaps not influenced by that, enjoy that, but on their own terms in different ways. The personal sense of satisfaction and well-being that I get from my clothing is tied to many different things. But from time and again, I think I find that when I spend time, and I perhaps say this because this is what most of my work at the moment is about, fashion and nature and design and nature, is when I spend time outdoors, and it doesn't mean in a wild place, it can mean just outdoors, outside of the built environment. It is a fundamentally different set of engagements that I have with myself and others. I think there's a sense that one is never judged by a woodland for how you're dressed. There's a total sense of acceptance, and that one carries out of the woodland and into the rest of the world. And so that clothes enable me first to go into the woodland, and then the reciprocal gift back is a totally different sense of myself in the world, is a huge, huge boon.
So by connecting to ourselves and nature, it might help be part of the solution to reducing textile waste as well, because we're more attached to what we have and more satisfied by other things. We're not seeking that churn and toss.
Well, you hope that that's the case. I mean, I think that the evidence suggests that it's not always as easy as hoping that if we're connected to something that we'll stop buying a new piece. Generally, if we're connected to something, we hang on to it, we make it keep going. That's what the evidence suggests. But it doesn't, there is no strong relationship then between us not buying another piece. We expand our wardrobes and we have an infinite capacity to want to have more meaningful garments. So what we need to do instead is to make or find a way to make a connection between feeling a sense of satisfaction with what we have and choosing not to break through limits and buy another piece. And at the moment, that's a tricky relationship. Maybe the best link with that I've found is through mindfulness. There's a sense that if one can want what you've already got, and this is partly through what I was saying a little earlier about noticing and paying attention. If you can be in the moment and attentive within that, it can undermine the desire to buy something new. But the big question, of course, is that all of the strategies that we are deploying, whether they're promoting durability or all the other ones, they sit within a system that is continually growing unless we're going to address the growth question at the same time. And this is the problem that we're facing, is that just making something that will last doesn't stop people buying 5 of them. And until we figure that relationship out, or until we take away growth as being the goal of the sector and put in another goal, other things won't happen.
So total change is really what you're calling for in Earth Logic, really, aren't you? That's very ambitious, and I admire you for it. Where are you up to with it? Like, how do you feel? Do you think our lived experience of climate change is going to help accelerate acceptance of a more earthy way of operating?
I think it is. So I've worked in this field for 30 years and there's been a massive shift in that time. It's almost like there's been waves crashing on the shore. So each time the new wave comes and then it sort of goes again. Each time that happens it crashes a bit further up the beach. I think now where the waves are crashing, it's a bit different. There's new dimensions to it, deeper questions, systems questions are being asked. Of course, as the old system sort of is hospiced, as we lose that and say goodbye to that, there's a lot of people dissatisfied and uncomfortable, and people have worked their whole lives for something that we're now saying, sorry, that wasn't so great. And that's quite hard to let go of. But things are shifting, and I think that there's more receptivity than ever before to these sorts of things. My sense is that the appetite for change is there. Over the course of the last 6 months, a policy brief was written about degrowth that was sent to the European Union. They just developed a new strategy for sustainable textiles, and the policy brief that then sits alongside that shows the limitations of the EU's policy. The EU is wedded to growth, and yet that this other thing exists, it creates an incredible counterpoint that, 5 years ago didn't exist. So there is a real sense that there's a change.
And how can individuals help accelerate that? Is it that easy, that individuals can make a difference?
Yeah, it is. It is true that individuals can make a difference. It's the sense here is that what we need to do is we need to mobilise people to think in different ways and to act in different ways. The two things, of course, come together. And maybe what we need to do is we find opportunities for clothing expression, for fashion action, which is not only within the market and not only shaped by the market's purpose. When we can find these moments within community groups, within schools, within libraries, within each other's homes, when we can re-find these things in these other places, what we'll experience is stuff with clothing that isn't only tied to this other logic of change. And that is really happening. We're now, more than ever before, we can see the sorts of things that we have done for a long time and we are doing, showing us the way. And these things, as Victor Papanak, who was like one of the design for sustainability pioneers, used to say, that when you design for the minority, you design for many different minorities, but together all of those minorities add up to the majority. And my sense here is that all of these so-called minority actions that we're doing in communities or homes, or all together, they will add up to be something that's larger than the industry space. And when that happens, that will be the moment where a real shift, and that'll be the tipping point, that moment where this action we've been going back and forth, and then we tip over into this new space of change, and that will be when things happen. And I don't think it's far away.
So, Kate, just wondering if you can talk to the question about, now we have ultrafast fashion. We've been trying to make some change, but nothing seems to have. What's that all about, and where's it going?
So, certainly the case that over the last 30 years, people in the fashion and sustainability space have been working really hard to try to affect change. Yet what we see in that time is that there's been no net improvement in the environmental quality of the fashion sector. And what I think we understand is that the gap between efficiency gains delivered by recycling, upcycling, substitution of one fibre for another is continually outpaced by a growing, continually expanding fashion sector. So we're in that sort of realisation that the gap between what our hopes are and what the sector's actual conditions are growing. And one of the things I think we realise is that over the last 30 years, people have been working really hard to try to affect change. It's just that we've been working in the wrong place. And that's difficult because I've been one of those people, and actually also maybe somewhat liberating because it makes us go, oh, okay, now we get it, now we understand why. And then we see an ultra-fast fashion brand that's just popped into the market in the last 6 months, come almost from nowhere. And how do we make sense of that? And I suppose from where I sit, I wonder, is it like the death throes of an injured beast? This is almost like the last moment that we'll see this type of industry action emerge as the sector begins to shift fundamentally to something entirely different. It is true that brands like H&M, who have for a long time been the sort of fast fashion model, not ultra fast fashion baby, but the fast fashion model, are really trying to grapple with what their responsibility is. Many would say that they're not going far enough, but also what we see is that over time, I think brands become more aware of their responsibility in this space. But ultimately, planetary limits will demarcate all human activity. And when resources continue to be constricted, when we begin to realise that we can't continue living as if we've got 4 planets when we've got one, or whatever it is, then things will profoundly change.